All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome everybody. I want to welcome those here in person, those of you joining us right now on Zoom. Happy Friday. We've all made it through another week. Congratulations. My name's Jeff Zay. I'm the Adult Programming Coordinator here at the Port Washington Library. We are continuing to offer our programs both in person, virtually, and hybrid style as in today's program. For those of you joining us on Zoom, I'm sure you're familiar, we have you muted during the program, but as always, you can type any questions you may have in the chat, and we'll go through those during Q&A at the end. And then we do have the, in case we don't, can you make sure the closed caption feature is on for today's program? For those of you here in person, when we do get to the Q&A portion, I'll ask that you raise your hand. I'll run over with a microphone. That way everybody will be able to hear your question. And then also for those of you joining us here in person, if you could just take a moment to silence your cell phones during the program. I want to let you know about some upcoming events, and then we'll dive into today's program. This coming Sunday, June 12th at 3 p.m., we will have a live music event featuring pianist Mark Valenti. Will be performing on the stage right behind me here. He will offer a journey through classical piano styles. His performance will include pieces by Mozart, Debussy, Chopin, and will provide an excellent overview of piano styles from classicism to romanticism and all the way through rhythmic percussiveness of modernism. So that will be this Sunday. Next Friday for our Sandwiched In program, that will be with Ricky Riccardi and a program entitled Black and Blue, Louis Armstrong as Ambassador of Goodwill during the Civil Rights Era. Mr. Riccardi, who is the Director of Research Collections at the Louis Armstrong House Museum, will explore the decade between 1955 and 1965, when Armstrong was hitting new points of popularity, especially overseas as a cultural ambassador for the United States. But in between history-making tours of Europe and Africa, Armstrong put his career on the line to speak out against racial injustice back home in the US. Mr. Riccardi will use rare videos, audio, and photos from the Armstrong archives in his multimedia presentation. And that program is part of our celebration of the Juneteenth holiday. And a special note about the program, due to a scheduling issue, Mr. Riccardi will be giving his presentation virtually, but we will project that presentation, live presentation here on the screen for those who attend in person. And then next Friday evening at 7 p.m., as another part of our ongoing celebration of Pride Month, you're invited to join filmmaker Isabel Del Rosal for a screening and discussion of her debut feature film, Walk With Me. The film is screened at 20 festivals worldwide and won numerous awards. We're very excited to host this special screening. The film follows Amber as she is forced to start over at the age of 30 with a young daughter after building up the courage to leave her husband and the only life she has ever known. As she struggles to find her way, she meets Logan, a free-spirited musician who lends an ear to Amber's situation. What starts out as a close friendship quickly evolves into an unexpected romance. Walk With Me explores what it means to be a woman, a mother, a daughter, and a lover, and shows how we embrace and reject who we are and how we eventually learn to stand tall in our own shoes. And this event is going to be co-sponsored by the Be the Rainbow organization, an LGBTQ inclusivity and visibility organization based here in Port Washington. So there's plenty more coming up in the month of June, so make sure to check out our newsletter and our website for some more information on those. So to get to today's program, I do want to thank our wonderful friends of the library organization for their support of today's event. And I'll give you a little background on our presenter today. Roger Rosen is a teacher, artist, performer, writer, activist, and husband. He is an adjunct professor teaching queer theory and critical thinking. He facilitates workshops on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and professional development trainings, and teaches master classes at a variety of institutions, all of which center on queer theory and history. Before he discovered his passion for teaching, Roger spent nearly 20 years exploring another passion, performing. That career took Roger through Europe, nearly all of the United States, and to Broadway, where he swung and dance captained the 2004 revival of Fiddler on the Roof. Roger holds a BFA in acting from Tisch School of the Arts at NYU and an MFA in Interdisciplinary Arts with a concentration in performance creation from Goddard College. And we're very happy to be welcoming Roger today as part of the library's celebration of Pride Month for an exploration of the history of the fight for gay rights, both before Stonewall as well as the 50+ years since. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Roger Rosen.
Hello. Thank you for coming today. I'm going to get my computer going here. In all honesty, we're going to look mostly at before Stonewall because I start in about 1897, and that's a long time to cover in an hour. But welcome to So Much More Than Stonewall, queer history before and a little bit beyond the Stonewall Riots. Thank you for joining me. This space is gorgeous, and thank you for joining me on Zoom, everybody currently eating lunch. I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited to be in this space with you, and honestly, I'm honored to be speaking the names and the events and the places that we're about to walk through, because these people and so many more made my life possible and made it possible for me to stand here. And you know, honestly, just to live my life. When we talk about Stonewall, we talk about a lot of things. We talk about the raids, and we talk about the riot that ensued. And I just want to take a moment before we rewind past Stonewall to talk about what that means, because I think we say it a lot, but we don't think about it. So the police routinely raided gay bars. That was a routine occurrence. In fact, it was the second raid that week. The Stonewall Riots, that was the second raid that week. So it happened all the time. Why did they raid the bars? It was totally legal. It was totally legal to raid those bars because cruising was illegal. It was illegal to ask someone of the same sex to go home with you. And so what happened was police officers would go into the bars, stand around, wait for someone to proposition them, and then they would arrest the person. This was considered de facto degenerate, disorderly conduct or degeneracy. From the years 1923 to 1966, over 50,000 men were arrested for flirting, right? So that's something to wrap your head around. In 1966, it became illegal for police to entrap gay men, so that was no longer a thing. However, the bars still had to hide or conceal any trace of queer identity. They could lose their liquor license for two men or two women kissing, dancing, holding hands. Again, that was considered simply disorderly conduct because it existed. For a bar to lose their liquor license is obviously a big deal. Any space that was found disorderly, which by the way was purposefully vague. Disorderly conduct was never fully outlined, which made it really easy to arrest people. There was also something called the Masquerade Law. The Masquerade Law is one of New York's oldest laws. Colloquially in the gay community, it's known as the Three-Article Law. What it actually said was, it was illegal to have your face painted, discolored, covered, or concealed, or be otherwise disguised while in a road or a public highway. Essentially, that meant being in drag was illegal. If a man put makeup on, only a man. Obviously, nobody was arresting women for wearing makeup. That was illegal, and you could be arrested. Women as well, wearing too many articles of men's clothing, whatever that means, illegal. So that's how we wind up at Stonewall. The riots began in the early morning hours of Saturday, June 28, 1969. The press almost did not cover the event. We're going to see a lot of other events that the press never covered. What they did cover took the event completely out of context, right? So it was just presented as young people who've lost their minds for no reason, doing awful things, setting cars on fire, just basically running amok in the streets. There was no kind of storyline around it. The New York Times published something about 4 police officers being injured and nothing about what was actually going on. They would eventually get to writing more about it on June 30th, and we were on page 22. So when the riots happened, they were not what we think of now as a big deal. They were to us, but in the press, not so much. The Daily News wouldn't get there until Sunday, July 6th. Right? That's over a week later. And when they did get to it, Homo nest raided, queen bees are stinging mad. This does not seem like something that's being taken seriously, right? Quite the opposite. Kind of denigrating what was going on. It's dismissive and it's condescending. A little bit more. This is from that article. She sat there with her legs crossed, the lashes of her mascara-coated eyes beating like the wings of a hummingbird. She was angry. She was so upset she hadn't bothered to shave. A day-old stubble was beginning to push through the pancake makeup. She was a queen of Christopher Street. Right? They're not taking us seriously. This is incredibly dismissive, never mind misogynistic. Last weekend, the Queens had turned commandos and stood bra strap to bra strap. The elite police squad had shut down one of their private gay clubs. And I just want to note the use of the word "there." Obviously written by straight people for straight people. They're talking about the queer community as something other. Their readership is considered straight, like we're just completely separated, right, from the rest of society. We may have lost the battle suites, but the war is far from over, lisped an unofficial lady in waiting from the court of the Queens. We've had all we can take from the Gestapo. The spokesman, or spokeswoman, continued, we're putting our foot down once and for all. The foot wore a spiked heel. This is actual coverage in a newspaper, and they were not kidding. The last thing I want to read from that article, my favorite line in the article. The whole proceedings took on the aura of a homosexual Academy Awards night. Okay, that's the most redundant sentence I've ever heard, number one. And number two, it's funny also because it speaks to the disconnect. A homosexual Academy Awards night, right? It's 1969. Who did the writer think had been making all of those movies? Who did the writer think was making the Hollywood product? It completely disconnects from the fact that we were there in Hollywood making those movies and essentially dictating the culture at large. We were writing the movies, we were in the movies, we were directing the movies, we were clothing the movies, we were doing the hair and makeup. But there's a disconnect here, right? The Queens pranced out to the street, blowing kisses and waving to the crowd. A beauty of a specimen named Stella wailed uncontrollably while being led to the sidewalk in front of the Stonewall by a cop. She later confessed that she didn't protest the manhandling by the officer. It was just that her hair was in curlers, and she was afraid her new beau might be in the crowd and spot her. She didn't want him to see her this way. She wept. Again, not particularly taking any of this very seriously, and certainly not putting it in context. And I also want to note what they seem to be harping on, and what we're going to see with laws and this article, and it's repeated over and over, isn't so much the offense at homosexuality, it's the offense at gender nonconformity, right? The worst thing that can happen is a man puts on a pair of heels, right? This is absolutely considered just too much to take and a reason to diminish that person. Marsha P. Johnson is a queer trans icon who was there. It's a slightly different take. People were hurt on the streets outside of the Stonewall because people were throwing bottles, and the police were out there with those clubs and riot helmets, beginning to get a little sense of what was actually happening. Sylvia Rivera, also there, another queer trans icon. It was getting vicious. There was Molotov cocktails coming in. The cops, they just panicked. They did not expect any of the retaliation. that the gay community gave. And one more, Miss Major Griffin Gracie, still with us, was there. She said when the Stonewall was raided, she joined in the ensuing riots and was knocked unconscious by the police and woke up in jail. And people think, oh, just one night of mayhem. There was 3 nights of absolute terror. And from the book Queer Injustice, just to put a fine point on it, at one point, 7th Avenue looked like a battlefield in Vietnam. Young people, many of them queens, were lying on the sidewalk, bleeding from the head, face, mouth, and even the eyes. Others were nursing bruised and often bleeding arms, legs, backs, and necks. This is very different than what was being reported as 4 injured police officers, or honestly, kind of a comedic, condescending article about what had happened that night. Dr. Eric Cervini, a queer historian, said Stonewall didn't start everything, but it certainly changed everything. So to be clear, Stonewall was just the tip of the iceberg, right? Things had been going, it didn't just occur out of nowhere. Things had been going on for many, many years. And I want to start with my own personal journey into queer history. I got to New York in 1990, and these were plastered absolutely everywhere. I had no idea what they were about. I was totally clueless. I really had no vague concept of any form of struggle or history, anything of that nature. But these were everywhere, and I was super curious why everybody was so angry. The pink triangle provided me with a great clue, and it was one of the things that propelled me to start looking into my queer history. This poster was made by the Silence Equals Death Collective around 1986 to protest the complete apathy surrounding the AIDS epidemic and crisis. The reason the pink triangle was picked as a symbol of queer pride, one of the reasons, was that there was a movement in conservative circles, and specifically on May 18th, 1986, William Buckley Jr. wrote an op-ed. He was a conservative pundit, a leading conservative pundit, and he was the editor of the National Review. He wrote an op-ed in the Times, quote, "Everyone detected with AIDS," he said, "should be tattooed in the upper forearm to protect common needle users and on the buttocks to prevent the victimization of other homosexuals." I'm sure he knew what he was saying when he was talking about tattooing people on their forearm. I don't know William Buckley, but that's my guess. Which is how we get to the pink triangle. The pink triangle was used in concentration camps in World War II to signify that you were in a camp because you were gay. An estimated 10 to 15,000 men were accused of homosexuality. They were imprisoned under paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code. It had been on the books for many years, and the Nazis strengthened it. Roughly 10 to 15,000 men. Many died in the camps. If you were gay and Jewish, your badge was both pink and yellow, interlocking. Also in Germany about this time, we have Magnus Hirschfeld, one of the most remarkable human beings. He was born in 1868. He was a world-renowned sexologist. He is credited with being one of the world's first advocates for queer rights and sexual minorities. And in 1897, let that sink in, 1897, he established the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. It was the world's first gay rights organization in Berlin. Of the world's first, but he was in Berlin. On July 6, 1919, he started the Institute for Sexual Research, which was an academic foundation devoted to sexological research and the advocacy of homosexual rights. It had a global reputation. It provided free counseling and healthcare For the record, Magnus Hirschfeld was brutally beaten by the Nazis for being both gay and Jewish. And in 1919, he made the world's first pro-gay movie called Different from the Others. What happened to all of his work? Well, on May 6, 1933, the Institute for Sexual Research was broken into and occupied by Nazi supporting youth. Several days later, on May 10th, this picture shows the entire contents of the library were moved to the streets and burned in public, including Different from the Others, which one of the texts that was burned was Heinrich Heine's, a play that he'd written in 1823, and I just wanted to use this quote here. It's a little bit of a side street. Where they burn books, in the end, they will burn humans too. So what happened to the gay prisoners after World War II? The Allies chose not to remove the Nazi amended paragraph 175. Neither they nor the German states nor Austria would recognize homosexual prisoners as victims of the Nazis, a status essential to qualify for reparations. Indeed, many gay men continued to serve their prison sentences. Let that sink in. The war is over. The camps have been liberated. The men who were in the camps because they were gay stayed in jail. They were not liberated. Oh no. Let's try that. That's better. So I spent quite some time in Berlin. I did that for a reason. Now we are going to travel to Chicago. Why Chicago? Because Chicago was the home of a man named Henry Gerber. He was born in Bavaria in 1892. In 1913, his family emigrated to Chicago, and in 1917, he was institutionalized for homosexuality. When the US declared war, he was given a choice. He could either enlist or he could remain interned as an enemy alien. He went to war. He went to Germany, where he discovered the work of Magnus Hirschfeld and the German homosexual emancipation movement. Now, if I can do this, we're going to watch about a minute-long video.
Henry Gerber was one of Chicago's first gay activists. In 1924, he helped establish the Society for Human Rights, an interracial group that was the first homosexual rights organization in America. While serving in the US Army during World War I, Gerber witnessed a movement for the emancipation of homosexuals in Germany. Inspired, he returned home and asked a number of prominent Chicagoans to support his cause. They refused. Gerber's neighbors on the north side, however, rallied behind him and founded the Society for Human Rights. Reverend John T. Graves, an African-American minister, served as president. Al Meininger, a self-proclaimed indigent laundry queen, served as vice president. He was bisexual and had a wife and 2 children. Shortly after the men took office, the police shut down the society. In 1925, detectives arrested Gerber, Graves, and Meininger. Gerber lost his job because, according to the post office personnel file, he was not a suitable person. Although no records remain, the others likely suffered too. It would take more than 30 years for another gay rights group to emerge in Chicago.
That is the Henry Gerber house, where he, remember, it's 1924. Think about this. It's 1924. He started a gay rights organization. This is decades before Stonewall. This is remarkable. That is his house, where he launched the Society for Human Rights. It is now a part of, it's a National Historic Landmark. It was not made a landmark until 2015, and it's the second historical landmark. Second only, the first one was Stonewall. We're still at the tip of the iceberg. There is so much to come. And now I want to tell you one of my favorite stories. This is Lucy Hicks Anderson. Lucy Hicks Anderson was born in 1886 in Waddy, Kentucky. She went to California at the age of 20. Her first marriage was at the age of 34 to Clarence Hicks. They moved to Oxnard, California, and they divorced. One of her jobs was running a boarding house, which was not really a boarding house. It was a house of prostitution. She was arrested twice during Prohibition for possessing liquor. In 1944, she married Corporal Reuben Anderson. When an outbreak of venereal disease was traced back to Lucy's boarding house, the health department went, a doctor was sent to look at everybody who worked in the boarding house. Lucy Hicks Anderson was one of those people, and it was at that point that Lucy Hicks Anderson's trans identity was made known to the public. Lucy was a fixture of society. She was a fixture of that community. So when news broke that this was a trans person, it was quite the local scandal. Lucy was known as a cook. She had worked in people's homes. She had a number of jobs. But this was a really big deal. She went to prison for a year and served 10 years of probation for falsifying a federal document, which would have been her marriage license. On the marriage license that she signed, it says no legal objections to the marriage. Obviously, the state considered Lucy Hicks Anderson a man, and therefore her marriage was illegal. She perjured herself on the marriage license. Her marriage was declared null and void. On her release from prison, she was one of the, can't think of the word. She was ordered by a judge to wear men's clothing, right? Again, gender non-conforming people. We're very confused by them as a culture, apparently. Yeah, on the condition of her release. That's the word I was going for. In 1945, all of the press that had happened during the trial got the attention of the Army. And they soon accused her of fraud for receiving her husband's military allotment checks. Because how can you receive that if you're not really legally married? In 1945, Lucy Hicks Anderson said in court, I quote, "I defy any doctor in the world to prove that I am not a woman. I have lived, dressed, acted just what I am, a woman. It is only petty maliciousness that is trying to cause me heartache and harm. If they would devote the same amount of energy to local problems that are hurting the community, it would be much better. I have lived a good life and a Christian life. I have lived a good citizen for many years in this town, and I am going to die a good citizen." 1945. It is considered the first time a trans person fought for their rights in court, not to mention marriage equality, which would have decades before we would start talking about it. From Oxnard, California, we're going to go to LA, where we're going to meet Harry Hay, who was born in 1912. Inspired by the Kinsey Report in 1948, he started the Mattachine Society in 1950 with the theory that gay men were an oppressed minority. Also, by way of kind of history and a link through history, Harry Hay had heard of the work nearly 30 years earlier, circuitously, of Henry Gerber. Henry Gerber, of course, had been inspired by Magnus Hirschfeld. So these things kind of continue, right? Nothing happens by itself. Harry Hay was part of mid-century queer activism, or actually considered the father of it, known as the homophile movement. He was a communist, and he started a group called the Mattachine Society, and you could see there's one of the magazines right there that they published. As the Mattachine Society grew, it became a nationwide organization with chapters throughout the country. It grew more conservative, too conservative and assimilationist for his taste. The group. Oh, and total sidebar. If you've ever looked through a kaleidoscope, his partner, John Burnside, invented the modern kaleidoscope. So every time you look at a kaleidoscope, just know that you are exploring gay pride. I always thought kaleidoscopes were fairly gay, I have to say. The Mattachine Society, I wish I could read that. Statement of purpose. There were 3 purposes that they stated when they started the Mattachine Society: to unify. We were basically alone. We didn't know where to find each other. To educate. Where in the 1950s are you going to find out about other gay people? There's nowhere to go. There's no internet. What you're going to find in the library, you're not going to like. Lots of us being tortured and us being, we're sick, all sorts of things. So to unite, to educate, and finally, it's not enough to have knowledge. You have to lead. You have to do something in the world with all of this information. After Stonewall, the Mattachine Society, this is a picture of Stonewall after the riots happened. The Mattachine Society wrote in the window, "We homosexuals plead with our people to please help maintain peaceful and quiet conduct on the streets of the village." That did not go well. It mood to play nicely. We're in the mood to be peaceful and quiet. We had been peaceful and quiet. It did not work. So in a very large respect, this moment kind of relegated the Mattachine Society almost to history. We were in another place at that point, and this is wildly out of step with what was going on politically. In Los Angeles in 1959, we get to the Cooper Donuts riot. It was a 24-hour cafe catered to lesbian, trans community, gay, lesbian, and trans community, due largely to the surrounding gay bars. It's one of the few establishments in LA to welcome transgender patrons. Of course, they faced routine harassment from the cops. What the cops would do is demand your ID. If your ID did not match your current gender presentation, you were arrested. Again, it's illegal to be gender non-conforming. This particular night in May 1959, 5 patrons, 2 drag queens, 2 male sex workers, and 1 gay man were led outside to be arrested, and one of them began to resist. People poured outside of the bar, and in a rather short time, that and the surrounding bars started to riot. It is the first instance of LGBTQ rebellion against police abuse in the United States. I always hesitate when we say the first instance of a thing. I always want to say the first known instance of a thing, because I usually find it hard to believe that anything would be the very, very first. Maybe sometimes, but usually I think things happen that we maybe don't know about. For example, people think Stonewall was the first. This is 10 years prior. If you've ever heard of the Red Scare, perhaps you have not heard of the Lavender Scare. In 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower deems homosexuals to be security risks and vows to rid the federal government of all employees discovered to be gay or lesbian. Literally tens or thousands of people lost their jobs. To be clear, as with the Holocaust, as with all of queer history, it is not really knowable how many people were impacted, because we did not tell our stories. If you were in a concentration camp for being gay, you did not go home and tell people that's why you were there, right? Most of the time. So our stories get kind of embedded into lies, right? We don't tell our stories for survival. So there's no way to know how many people were really genuinely impacted by the Lavender Scare. Communism was linked to homosexuality, and just one giant, it's totally all immorality was kind of viewed as one thing. You were morally weak, you were psychologically disturbed, and to be clear, homosexuality was still illegal. Estimated that between 5,000 and 10,000 people lost their job. Should you be pulled into a room where you had no legal recourse, in the same way that they said, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? They said, we have information that leads us to believe you are a homosexual. Do you have any comment? At that point, you were done. It was already too late. And again, you were not getting a lawyer. You were not, this was in motion. I do want to point out that in 1980, this was still going on. Wasn't taken to the books until, I believe, 94, entirely. Jamie Shoemaker, in 1980, was called into an office where he worked for the federal government, and he says, they read me my rights, and they said, we understand you're leading a gay lifestyle. And he said, well, I didn't think I was leading it, but I am gay. Maybe my favorite answer ever. It's a really funny answer. However, he did lose his top secret security clearance. He was separated from his fellow employees, and he was eventually fired. Going back to the beginnings of the Lavender scare, we have Dr. Frank Kameny. As much of an American force as I think we have maybe in history. He graduated Harvard with a doctorate in astronomy, and in 1957 he was dismissed from his position as an astronomer in the U.S. Army's Army Map Service in Washington, D.C. He was fired because he had been arrested the previous year for having consensual sex with another man. He did not go quietly. He spent years writing letters, going to court, and failing. He did not win one case. And in fact, what do you do after 3 years when you've reached the end of your rope? There's nowhere else to turn, and no lawyer will take your case. You petition the United States Supreme Court yourself, which is exactly what he did. Oh, I think I'm getting a text. I hope somebody watching telling me I'm doing well. He does not shy away from the fact that he had been arrested for having sex. In fact, he leans totally into it. He talks about it in his petition to the Supreme Court. But one thing that he does I find so remarkable, never mind the fact that he did not go quietly, never mind the fact that he fought, never mind the fact that he couldn't get a lawyer, think about this, and he petitioned the Supreme Court himself. He does not argue that homosexuality is not immoral. He actually argues that homosexuality is moral. And I find that leap to be so remarkable. I'm in awe, honestly. In his brief, he says, but what is immoral conduct? Petitioner asserts flatly, unequivocally, and absolutely uncompromisingly that homosexuality, whether by mere inclination or overt act, is not only immoral, but that for those choosing voluntarily to engage in homosexual acts, such acts are moral and in a real and positive sense are good, right, and desirable socially and personally. I do not know how one makes that leap, but I find it mind-blowingly brilliant and brave and astounding. He was way ahead of the curve. Most organizations at that point were only pleading for tolerance. They were not on an offensive, saying, not only is this not immoral, it's actually fantastic. The Supreme Court did not hear his case. He obviously then did not win his case. But I would argue that this document is a remarkable step forward. That was in 1960. Here is Frank Kameny. In 1965, he organized protests out in front of the White House, as well as in other places. Again, 4 years before Stonewall, if you're using Stonewall as, the thing, kind of the milestone. This is 4 years prior to Stonewall. There are people picketing the White House, which he was one of the organizers. He also was the founder of the DC branch of the Mattachine Society. He coined the slogan, "Gay is good," after listening to Stokely Carmichael chant "Black is beautiful" in 1968. Over and over, we're going to see that the gay rights movement owes a huge debt to the civil rights movement. Huge debt. Frequently, and at the time, an unspoken debt. We took a lot of tactics and used them, tactics that the civil rights movement had been using and was used and used. Frank Kameny also, along with Barbara Gittings and Henry Anonymous, MD, in 1972, we're just going to skip a little forward quickly, they lobbied the American Psychiatric Association to take homosexuality out of the DSM. We were labeled as sick, right? The reason that Henry Anonymous, MD, is in a disguise is because he was a gay psychiatrist. He said at this conference, "I am a homosexual, I am a psychiatrist." You can imagine what that was like. You could lose your license and your entire business. You cannot be in the DSM and practicing psychiatry. We learned many years later that that very brave person's name was Dr. John Fryer. He spoke about 10 minutes to the American Psychiatric Association in his pivotal moment in the fight for gay rights. I frequently wonder what it was like for Frank Kameny in 2009, on June 17, 2009, when President Barack Obama signed a signing ceremony granting some workers some benefits to same-sex partners of federal workers. And I wonder what that moment was like for Frank Kameny. That is President Obama giving Frank Kameny one of the pens he uses to sign that. And I find it remarkable, having lived that life, to wind up in the president's office at that moment. Spoke briefly about Barbara Gittings, also influential in these demonstrations that mostly took place between 1965 and 1969. One of them happened every year on July 4th. It was the annual reminder protest now that LGBTQ Americans did not have basic civil rights. They did this picketed at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. 4 years. The last year was July 4th, right after Stonewall, 1969. They went and organized around Stonewall. I want to read that. Barbara Gittings was known as the mother of the LGBTQ civil rights movement. She edited The Ladder, which was the first widespread lesbian journal, and she led initiatives to promote LGBTQ literature in libraries. We are still having that conversation. And she fought to remove it as a classification as a mental illness. In 1955, the country's first lesbian rights organization was started in San Francisco, mostly attributed to Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, but actually the woman whose idea it was to start the lesbian rights organization that would be known as the Daughters of Bilitis was a Filipina named Rosalie Rose Bamberger. And for some reason, her name is not often spoken. Barbara Gittings started the New York chapter of the Daughters of Bilitis in 1958. And this is where things kind of start to get interesting. We often speak of movements as having no tension. There's a great deal of tension here. With Barbara Gittings, with people with different and varying identities, there's frequently a lot of friction. So Barbara Gittings, as the 70s moved into the women's movement, She faced homophobia from the women's movement and misogyny from the gay rights movement. So I just want to bring up, we don't always agree, and we're not without tension in our history. Here is Barbara Gittings in the third picket line in the White House, in front of the White House, October 23rd, 1965. And if you look at that picture towards the background, you see this sole Black woman, one of the only Black people picketing, and certainly one of the only Black women, if not the only Black woman. That person is Ernestine Eckstein. Is the name she went by. Her actual name was Ernestine Peppinger. She's from Indiana. She went to Indiana University, born in 1941. Her sign says, "Denial of equality of opportunity is immoral." She was also a leader in the New York chapter of the Daughters of Bilitis. She was an early activist in the Black feminist movement in the 70s, and she viewed the fight for civil rights and LGBTQ rights as inextricably linked. Here she is on the cover of The Ladder, which is that lesbian magazine. I just want to point out it says adults only. We're still talking about, to this day, what is appropriate for children. There was nothing inappropriate in this magazine other than the content, that it was about lesbians. She brought her on-campus expertise to the gay rights movement that she had learned from the African-American civil rights movement. And she's pivotal in the gay rights movement because she brings into the space differing identities, right? She forces question about being Black and queer and a woman. In April 25th, 1965, we have Dewey's sit-in, staged by teenagers. Again, you could see the direct line in the civil rights movement. We're sitting in now. Dewey's refused service to homosexuals, masculine women, feminine men, and persons wearing non-conformist clothing. They were arrested for disorderly conduct. So 3 teenagers staged a sit-in. They were arrested. In the next 5 days, they stood out and handed out pamphlets. May 2nd, sat in the same place. They did not get arrested. Right? So we're moving along. If at this point you're like, oh my God, this is getting super repetitious, it's the same thing over and over again. That is partially my point. Stonewall did not just happen, right? We've been doing this for a long time. This is the Compton's Cafeteria Riot, 1966, in San Francisco. One August evening in 66, we do not know when. No one recorded it. In fact, I think the first known writing about it is 1972, as far as I know. Trans women and gay men banded together to fight back against oppression after a police officer harassed one of them at Gene Compton's cafeteria. This confrontation was the first known full-scale riot for trans and gay rights in US history. If you watch the reboot of Tales of the City, it's a plot point. They actually, Compton's cafeteria riot is in the new Tales of the City.
They come down there to raid Compton's to begin with. That's what it was all about.
What happened then was the situation got a little bit out of hand.
The document that launched my research in the first place said the fighting started when a policeman grabbed one of the queens and she threw her coffee in his face.
Someone had thrown coffee in his face, and there was tables turned over.
Compton's erupted. People started throwing everything they could get their hands on at the police.
Oh, the sugar shakers went through the windows and the glass doors. I think I put a sugar shaker through one of those windows.
The hustlers kicked the police and punched them, and the drag queens beat them with their heavy purses. The cops retreated outside to call for backup, but cafeteria customers, maybe 60 in all, poured into the streets through the broken doors and windows and kept fighting as the paddy wagons pulled up.
All those plate glasses windows here were broken out. And of course they had the paddy wagons, and they were putting people in the paddy wagons as they would come out and or start fighting.
What happened? I mean, what did people do? Did they run around out here in the just like all up and down the streets?
Up and down the street that was over here, or they...
Before it was over, a police car was destroyed, the corner newsstand was set on fire, and years of pent-up resentment boiled out into the night. It was the first known instance of collective, militant, queer resistance to police harassment in United States history.
That's the nearly forgotten about Compton cafeteria riot, preceding Stonewall by 3 years. New Year's Eve, 1967, we're back to LA. What do people do on New Year's Eve? What do you do at the stroke of midnight? You grab the people you're with and you kiss them. If you are in a gay bar and you do that at the Black Cat in 1967, you will be arrested and you will be beaten. There were police officers that were on the scene, and as we turned to each other to celebrate the new year, the assaults began. They escalated into brutal beating and eventually spread to a neighboring bar. After arresting several patrons for kissing, the undercover police officers started beating more and arresting more for assault and public nudeness. No, that's not right. Assault and public lewdness. 2 bartenders were beaten unconscious. A female manager, a cis female woman at another bar, was assumed to be a man in drag and severely beaten. At the end of the night, 14 people were arrested, and 2 of the men caught kissing were forced to register as sex offenders. There was a civil demonstration, but a month later, where 200 attendees demonstrated. Another demonstration, another protest. It was not, I think I misspoke, it was not a riot, it was actually quite peaceful. And one of the last ones we're going to get to, because this one I find just entertaining if you're going to be arrested. There was in Wilmington, California, there was the Patch Bar Flower Power protest. Why were we arrested again? We were arrested for all the same reasons. We were arrested for gender nonconformity, we were arrested for kissing, we were arrested for hugging, right? All of these things, they are the same, they are repetitious. And it keeps happening. So what happened was, 2 men were arrested. The owner of the bar decided to go down to the precinct. On their way, they went to a flower shop owned by one of the patrons. They bought tons of flowers, and they showed up at the precinct while they were waiting to bail their friends out. That's why it is known as the Flower Power protest. They didn't do anything, they showed up with flowers. It's very, very late 1960s. It didn't want to end before getting to 2 absolute American icons. Bayard Rustin, born in 1912. In 1941, he worked on the March on Washington movement to press for the end of discrimination employment. He was a labor organizer. He organized the Freedom Rides. If you have heard of nonviolent resistance and you associate that with Dr. King, he taught Dr. King about nonviolent resistance. If you've heard of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, he put that together. He did it without fax machines, he did it without texting, he did it without any of our current technology. He put together that movement, that march. He had been arrested in Pasadena for having sex with two men in a car. Because of that and because of the general discomfort with his homosexuality, he was never put up front in the civil rights movement, even though he was one of its architects. He stayed largely in the background, and I think, unfortunately, remains in the background to this day. Let's see.
Executive Director of the March on Washington, the man who organized this whole thing, Mr. Bayard Rustin. Ladies and gentlemen,
the first demand is that we have effective civil rights legislation, no compromise, no filibuster, and that it includes public accommodation, decent housing, integrated education, FAPC, and the right to vote. What do you say?
There we go. Talking about some of that tension that exists between identities in the gay rights movement, I want to talk I could talk forever about Pauli Murray. If you have never heard of Pauli Murray, I would ask that when you leave today, you ask yourself why. How it is possible that you have potentially never heard of Pauli Murray. Born in 1910, in 1963, Pauli Murray complained to A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and Dr. Martin Luther King because they failed to include a single female speaker at the March on Washington. In 1940, Pauli Murray and Pauli Murray's friend, Adeline McBean, known as Mac, refused to relinquish their seats to white bus riders and were arrested in Durham, North Carolina, charged with creating a disturbance and breaking the segregation law. Again, it's 1940. It is 15 years before Rosa Parks. Pauli's work throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s brought them into contact with leaders of the civil rights and women's movements, and Pauli was frustrated by the lack of intersectionality between the movements. In 1966, Pauli partnered with Betty Friedan and to co-found the National Organization for Women, but Pauli worried that it did not do enough to include women of color and working class women. So this is very small, but I want to read this because I'm going to go slowly. These are some of his accomplishments, and it's what that plaque says. Anna Pauline Murray began to grapple with sexual orientation and gender identity while attending Hunter College in New York City. Murray adopted the gender-neutral first name Pauli as a way to reject both male and female identity. This subtle change had to suffice because gender-neutral pronouns like they and them to identify as non-binary were not an option in 1933. After being rejected by the University of North Carolina for being Black, Murray chose to pursue a law degree from Howard University, graduating top of the class. Though this achievement automatically entitled enrollment in Harvard Law School, Murray was again rejected, this time for being female, having already co-founded the Congress of Racial Equality in 1942, a highly influential civil rights organization. Harvard's refusal compounded Murray's anger over baseless disenfranchisement. Murray then received a master's in law with a concentration on equal rights for women, and from the University of California, Berkeley, Murray described these race and gender-based discriminatory barriers as Jane Crow. Motivated by personal experiences, Murray wrote several this is the part where I'm like, are you kidding? Murray wrote several highly influential scholarly treatises on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, published collectively in 1951 as States' Laws on Race and Color, This towering work was dubbed by Thurgood Marshall as, quote, the Bible for civil rights lawyers. Murray co-founded the National Organization for Women and served on the board of the ACLU. Murray's writings were involved in nearly every major Supreme Court case to challenge the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. From Brown v. Board of Education's integration of schools in 1954 to Ruth Bader Ginsburg's triumph in Reed v. Reed's prohibition of sex discrimination in 1971, to Obergefell v. Hodges' legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015, to Bostock v. Clayton's protections of LGBTQ employees in 2020, all can be traced back in some way to Pauli Murray. After spending decades reshaping the US legal landscape for all minorities, Murray retired to study divinity. The Episcopal Church celebrated its ordination of Murray as its first female African-American priest in 1977. And here we get into whether or not we can say that, how was Pauli Murray trans? We do not know. Gender non-conforming, to be sure. But Pauli Murray never declared any of these words themselves. After serving with distinction, Pauli Murray passed away from pancreatic cancer on July 1st, 1995 at 74, a quiet ending for the person whose work changed everything. That is what that plaque says, and I just thought, I'm going to read that because it's too much. If you have Amazon, let's see if I can do it. If you have Amazon, I strongly encourage you to watch My Name is Pauli Murray. Okay.
There are some people who now argue that you cannot teach American history without teaching about Pauli Murray.
Pauli was a writer, a lawyer, a priest, a poet.
Pauli was a feisty woman.
My name is Pauli Murray. My whole history has been a struggle in a society dominated by the ideas that blacks were inferior to whites and women were inferior to men.
Pauli was way ahead of the times.
I chose for my senior paper, should Plessy versus Ferguson be overruled? My little argument went to the Supreme Court.
Y'all see all of the different folks that are in this room? That is made possible by Pauli Murray.
If you rip away everything, oppression is the business of not respecting one's personhood. For my first 2 years, I was the only woman in the law school. They didn't even let me talk.
Thurgood Marshall is talking about Jim Crow, and she says, what I'm experiencing is Jane Crow.
Pauli Murray was not just an amazing lawyer or a badass feminist, but also a queer, non-binary person.
Sitting in front of Murray's notes, the turmoil and the suffering, this is a feeling I know well.
Scholars who have written about Pauli largely still use feminine pronouns. I don't know what pronouns Pauli would say.
Trans and gender non-binary people have always been a part of our American context. So did y'all just think that your generation invented it?
But
if this country is to survive, we must live together in harmony.
Pauli may not have realized they would be a beacon for so many folks.
Pauli's time had not come. We have to work for a world in which it does come.
You say I can't, I'll show you I can, even if I die trying.
That's October 1st of 2020. So if you have Amazon Prime, I urge you to go home. Audre Lorde, one of my favorite writers, authors, activists, wrote in an essay, I am a Black lesbian mother, warrior, poet doing my work, coming to ask you if you are doing yours. I love that challenge. I love the challenge of that quote. Because the question is anything that I just presented relevant? And I would argue all of it is relevant. It is all relevant because all of the ideas that people were protesting are still present today. The idea that gay people are sick, still present today. We still have conversion therapy, right? The idea that there's that trans people are in the masquerading law, that you are trying to trick people. The idea that being gender nonconforming is still illegal. A lot of places, certainly we're fighting battles for healthcare for trans children. So while so much of this, the laws have changed, the ideas that these activists were reacting to, that these riots, that the protests were in reaction to, we live in them still. They are not history, they're horrifyingly relevant, and they're horrifyingly present. From Florida's Don't Say Gay law to Texas saying if you get appropriate health care for your trans child, that is considered abuse, right? But all of these ideas are very, very present. Even marriage equality, it's currently winding its way through the courts. It's unlikely they will strike it down entirely, but the cases moving through the courts look to gut my marriage. What I mean by that is, I will likely still be married, but if you choose not to recognize it, you will have the legal right. Those are the cases moving through the courts. In terms of serving gay people, we saw Dewey's sit-in, right? So we have cases now where people can decide they do not have to serve me a cake. So while the pictures are black and white, the ideas are terrifyingly relevant. So I want to leave you with that, Pauli Murray, and leave you with the idea that we have so much work to do. And I want to thank you for joining me today. Oh, and by the way, if my parents are still there, their anniversary, their 57th wedding anniversary is June 12th. Hi, happy anniversary. The card is sitting in my kitchen. Okay. So thank you for joining me today and for allowing me to speak a few names who I revere. Yeah, and if anybody has any questions, I would love to have this conversation.
Terrific. Well, let's have a round of applause for Roger Rosen. I want to thank you so much for your presentation today. I'm going to get to some questions, and if folks here have questions, please raise your hand. I'll come around with the mic. I just want to quickly point out we took a selection of books and a couple of DVDs from the library's collection. They're on display in the back. Those, you're welcome to check those out if you wish. And I just want to thank you, Roger. I feel like I've become more aware, more educated from your presentation today. I have new names of brave people that it's shocking that we don't know these names as household names because of their courage and their bravery.
And brilliance.
And importance to American history, yep. Absolutely. So one of the questions I want to get to here, someone else has said happy anniversary to the Rosens. And we have a thank you for your presentation. One of the questions here is, what can young queer people who weren't alive or didn't grow up learning about Stonewall and other injustices of the queer community do to remember these events?
Listen, right? But I say that without judgment. When I was a young person, I didn't think anything that came before me was particularly important or had any relevance to my life. It's only as I got older that I realized all of these things are terribly important because they're still happening. I think curiosity, and I honestly think a lot of this, I've met, I could get in trouble for saying this. In my experience, I have met very few people who don't wrestle with their own internal homophobia to some greater or lesser extent. That is my experience. Don't come at me. And I think seeing that, recognizing that, and starting to look at where that comes from, right? That's not something we're born with. That is something that is given to us. And when you start to look at the messages coming at you, you can't help but start to uncover a bit of history and uncover a bit of why those ideas exist in our culture the way that they do. So that would, and Google.
Sure, absolutely.
Google, you could fall down a rabbit hole. I have like 150 more slides. I just wanted to keep going.
So another question, and you were certainly referencing it. Obviously there has been Supreme Court decisions and progress that has occurred over the decades since Stonewall, but obviously you're still drawing some very clear lines to things that are going on today, book challenges, state laws, things of that nature. So I think we can sometimes see, a backlash to progress, and it seems to me that may be something that's occurring now. I'd like to just hear your thoughts on some of the current climate right now.
Well, I think two things can exist at the same time. I get nervous. I went to an event the other day, and it was with historian George Chauncey, and he spoke of, we only ever speak of queer history as being kind of tortured and being so sad, which is, when you talk about activism, that's what sparks that. But he wanted to focus on joy. There's queer joy. And I get nervous when I do a program like this, and we talk about where we were and maybe where we are now, that I dismiss the progress we've made. All of those people, great progress, and I would never. But I frankly think we're living in incredibly regressive times. I think these are terrifying times. When we talk about, Roe v. Wade, which might have happened while they might have handed down that decision while I was talking. I find the times we're living in to be fairly terrifying, actually. So we keep doing our work.
Thank you. We have another question here in the chat. Do you think we've at least become aware of most injustices? For instance, there was a time when we put deaf or mentally ill people in pits with chains. We have certainly recognized our injustices against Black people and Jews and the Japanese. We have a long way to go with all of it, but can you think of something where we are prejudiced that we might not be aware of, that we'll look back in horror a few decades from now, like we do, for example, now with our treatment of gays and lesbians? That's a tough question there.
That's a tough one, because I'm not smart enough to know what's going to happen in a few decades. To me, it is constant work. I find it constant work. There are ideas present in our culture, whether they're racist, classist, homophobic, transphobic, and they're so much a part of our culture that they are hard to see. It's just kind of a baseline thought that we are given. And to me, the way forward is to be conscious of ourselves and how we are in the world and how we are with others. The quote at the end of the Pauli Murray clip of the promo, I'm going to quote it poorly. The business of oppression is to rip away one's, I can't think of the word, but to treat people with disrespect, honestly. And I think it's so embedded in our culture that is, to me, you just keep doing the work. I don't know where we'll be in 20 years. It's possible we'll find this online in 20 years, everything I just said, and I will be canceled, and it'll be terrible for me. But in my head, I think things becoming dated isn't the worst thing. It shows a bit of movement and a bit more thought. So if I see this in 20 years and I cringe, I wouldn't think it's the worst thing.
Someone put a note here in the chat, personhood.
Thank you. Thank you for that. The business of oppression is ripping away one's personhood. That is not a direct quote, but I think it all the time.
Yeah, and obviously there is some commonality to fear of that which is different I think that runs through so many of the human struggles that have happened over our history. So again, I just want to, unless anyone else has any comments or questions here, I just want to thank you again, Roger, for educating us, for helping make us more aware. I want to wish you a happy Pride Month, and I look forward to seeing all of you at some of our other upcoming programs. Just a reminder that we have the film screening and discussion next Friday evening. I know there's some community events going on this weekend. So again, I want to thank everybody for being here. Thank you, Roger, for your time, your travel from New Jersey, which I know was not easy. And again, wish everybody a great weekend. So thanks very much.
Thank you all.